other people to arrive. There's some extra. All right, hello everybody. Welcome to the Rental Housing Advisory Board holding a special meeting to talk about the various options we have regarding rental housing inspections in the city of Oshkosh. Thank you for coming on such a dreary day, but hopefully we'll enlighten you as to where the things, what your options are. Before I forget, we do have a Polco survey instrument that's already been set up. We have a computer that's already set up for people who want to vote, and a handout that you can take home and share with your friends and neighbors regarding other people who would be interested in the Polco. Before I get any farther, though, we should do some introductions. I'm Alan Davis, Community Development Director with the City of Oshkosh, and perhaps I could start with the people at the table. If you could introduce yourselves, please.
Yes, Lori Palmieri, Deputy Mayor, and also the Council Liaison for Rental Housing Advisory Board.
Steve Cummings, Mayor.
Cheryl Hens, Chair of the Rental Housing Authority Board.
Linda Givaltis, I'm on the Rental Housing Advisory Board.
John Zarate, I'm the Chief Building Official for the City of Oshkosh.
Tim Ernst, I serve on the Advisory Board.
Matthew Steenerson, I also serve on the Advisory Board.
All right, thank you. Does everybody have a copy of the PowerPoint slides that I'm going to be going through? What I'd ask is that you hold the questions till I get to the end, and then I'd ask you to come up to the podium so that we can hear everybody's questions, and it can be recorded for posterity. This will be posted to the city's website at some point soon once this meeting is concluded.
Ellen, do you require name and address?
We typically have at the Rental Housing Advisory Board. All right. With the first slide, and I'll see if I can get it to work. Great. The reason the city is embarking on this analysis and recommendation is that state law, Act 317, was recently adopted this spring. The city follows the state law when it comes to rental inspection programs. And in this particular case, the city has a contact listing and registration that was allowed to continue. We have maps that are in the room there that shows who's been registered and where they're located in the city. So maybe after the presentation, you can take a look at those maps. And one change of the state law that the city can implement a district-specific program for inspections. Our interpretation of the law previously is it had to be citywide, but now the legislature says you can pick a particular neighborhood or a group of blocks. Really, the design is up to the city as to where they'd want the inspection program to exist. And the legislature altered what the city may charge for inspection fees so we'll follow the state statute, and I got a slide on that a little later on. That in general covers what the state law changed, but I'll get more detailed with all those bullet points right there. We already have on the next slide a rental contact listing and registration. That's on the web. That's available 24/7. Voluntarily, you can sign up for email contacts if you wish to be informed when the city has any contact with the property. There's no fee for this, regardless of the parcel, regardless of the number of units that are contained on the parcel. And in this particular case, we think this is still important for the city because rental inspections and rental contacts can be quite difficult. Sometimes there's local ownership, sometimes it's non-local, could be California, could be anywhere in the world. Also, foreclosures and bankruptcies, they have a tendency of creating problems for us tracking down owners, sometimes phone numbers and management's not known. Then the LLCs that often own rental properties do not always provide updated information. And then last but not least, police and fire department personnel lack emergency contacts, and code enforcement find it difficult to deliver any kind of notices to the owners. So we still will plan on continuing with a rental contact listing. And on the next slide, kind of shows you that map. It's hard to see on the PowerPoint, but we have much more more detailed maps here in the room that show the color coding for all those parcels that have been identified in the city, and how many dwelling units have been recorded as well. Now, the first option I wanted to review was the complaint-based. We are doing complaint-based inspections. We did suspend the other inspections that we were doing pending the state law deliberations and the deliberations the city is going through right now. But complaint-based is currently active. That's when we perform interior and exterior inspections based on the complaints lodged with the inspection division. All codes are applied, and we have a fee schedule for that. The costs are recovered with the fees charged if code violations are found. If we find no code violations, we do not charge for that inspection. And then the neighborhood impact is limited to the parcels that have the complaint, but it's certainly not systematic or neighborhood-wide. It's parcel by parcel. And the limited number of violations are corrected because the complaint-based is so few and far between when it comes to how many are actually recorded. The other program on the next slide, I'm sorry, I'm a slide behind. I'll let everybody catch up. Now you've had 20 minutes to read all these. I'm probably repeating things that you've already read. We have on the next one, that's what we were doing last year in 2017 and the early part of 2018 when the city was sending out letters to the tenants. The green means that we did the inspection. The blue means we did the exterior inspection only. And the red, we sent out the letter, but we didn't get a response back from the tenant. And that's when we froze the program or suspended the program earlier this spring. And let me give you the details of how that program could work in the city based on the new state law. And now I've caught up to the inspection option number 2. This would be performed both interior and exterior inspections. We wouldn't do just the exterior only that we had been doing last year. The fees would still be based on the state statute, and I've got a slide on that. In this particular case, we send out a letter to the tenant inviting them to ask for an inspection. The fiscal impact would be $50,000 is our estimated cost, depending on the number of districts and the number of dwelling units that participate in the program. This neighborhood impact would be limited, however, in that the tenant would still have to approve the inspections. And based on our experience in 2017 and early 2018, somewhere between 5 and 10% of tenants take us up on that offer. So it certainly doesn't cover the entire block or the neighborhood. But any violations that are identified are corrected. And the rental housing inspection program, based on state law, the district would schedule inspections once every 5 years. The city would contact the tenants to arrange for the inspection. If there are code violations identified, landlords have 7 to 30 days to correct those unless an extension is granted, usually based on availability of contractors or weather conditions or things of that nature. Dwelling units where habitability violations are not corrected in 30 days will have additional re-inspections until violations are corrected. So once it's identified, we'll keep going back until the violation is corrected. If the dwelling unit will be required to pass 2 consecutive annual inspections before they return to the 5-year inspection cycle. So if you have violations that exceed the 30 days, you'll be inspected for 2 consecutive years before you get the 5-year back into the 5-year cycle. And landlords can still arrange for vacant unit inspections as well. And there's a bit of a fee break, the way the legislature wrote that as well. Next slide, very similar to what we were doing earlier regarding residential rental dwelling units. None of these would be owner occupied. They'd all have to be rented out. The one area that is different is the Neighborhood Stabilization and Enhancement District would have to be identified and approved by council. That's basically the maps that we have in the displayed tonight that identifies where we think these areas need this type of inspection. The Rental Housing Advisory Board here tonight would review and could make a recommendation on the maps as well as the type of inspections to be done. The complaint-based inspections would be added to this program. So the complaint-based that we're already doing, if the inspection on a complaint outside the district, if those violations are not corrected, then our interpretation of state law is that those parcels would then be incorporated into that neighborhood, whether it's actually physically there or not. So if the complaint-based violation is not corrected, then you get put into the 5-year cycle. And there's still some exemptions regarding the other exemptions that existed prior to the state law changing. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, just kind of a question along those lines, Mr. Davis. So, along with a complaint-based inspection that would arise, bringing that into the NSED, I'm going to say that Stabilization Enhancement District, would it also, if a couple of cycles go through, they've passed on the initiated inspection by the city, would that, if they also had a complaint that came in further into the cycle, add them back in so it's not just those habitability violations, adding it into the inspection? I guess what I'm trying to say is, are there other scenarios in which they might have passed and gone into the 5-year cycle, but then kind of gone back into the complaint based and brought them back in? I mean, is it kind of an in and out, or is it all or nothing?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe once you're in, you're in.
Okay.
If it's a complaint, and it has to be a complaint that is not corrected in 30 days or within the time frame the inspector allows. So once you're in, I think you're in the inspection program, whether you have more complaints or you pass everything in the future. Once you're in theory, I think the council would have to dissolve the program to get out.
Okay.
Just thinking off the top of my head.
Or possibly the area.
Yes,
I would think too.
if the district area is eliminated. Okay, then I would attempt to continue with the next slide. Just as a reminder, the city sends the letter out to the tenants requesting the inspection date and time. The tenant is required to contact the city to schedule the inspection, and the tenant may invite the landlord to the inspection. The inspection is based on a checklist that we've provided people over the last few years. That was one thing that people seemed to like quite a bit, and that didn't change. If there's no charge for the inspection, if there's no code violations, if violations are found, the inspector would reduce this to writing and send a letter to the landlord with that list of violations. And if the landlord corrects all the violations within 30 days, there's no charge for the reinspection. If the violations are not corrected, that's when the fees would actually kick in. And here's a very small version of the inspection checklist. I do have full-size copies here in the room that we can provide you before you leave. I'm not expecting you to read all those, but that's something we've used for the last couple years, and based on our reading of the state law, it touches on the habitability concerns that are identified by the legislature. So don't leave without your checklist, please. So then there's a couple of questions that I threw in here. What are rental housing program inspections going to cost a landlord? As a reminder, the contact listing and registration is no cost. The tenant-approved inspections would be performed once every 5 years within the district. $0 if the unit has no violations after the inspection, and it's still $0 if the unit violations are corrected within 30 days. So if you have the inspection done and the inspector finds on average 4 to 5 violations, if you can get those corrected, you still don't pay any kind of fee. It's only after the 30 days are up that you'd be required to pay a $240 fee if the unit violations are not corrected, and then each subsequent inspection is $150. And you can see in the parentheses, if it's a vacant unit, It's 150 for the first and 75 for the subsequent inspections. And then there's the question, what if the landlord does not agree with the inspector's findings of a code violation? The way we've set it up in the past, and it looks like it continues that way, is the landlord could appeal the inspector's findings to the Zoning Board of Appeals, and they would meet to determine whether the conditions meet the minimum codes or not. The Zoning Board of Appeals meets on a monthly basis here at the City of Oshkosh, and we send notices to the neighbors, and everybody's notified, so everybody has an opportunity to speak, and the Zoning Board of Appeals votes on that, on the code violation or not. And even then, if the landlord or city are not satisfied with the ruling, either could appeal the ruling to Winnebago County Circuit Court. So there is an appeal process within the city and to the court system. Then another question, what if the landlord does not have the resources to correct the health and safety code violations? Before you leave, I have 2 program handouts that I want you to take with you regarding some loan programs that may help finance the improvements. The landlords would have to apply and meet qualifications. 2 programs are targeted in the neighborhood associations, but in some cases can be used on units built prior to 1970 in other parts of the city. And depending on demand, we could create another program through our community development block grant program if landlords would want to use that program. That one requires more strings, and it requires tenants to get involved. So typically landlords haven't used that one. That's why we created these 2 other programs separate from the CDBG program. So before you leave, take those 2 program flyers with you, please. And sometimes people want to ask, where are the neighborhood associations? And here's a map that shows where the neighborhood associations are. A lot of them are concentrated there in the traditional part of the city where we have a lot of the rental housing. So the opportunity for the funding in those neighborhood associations is actually pretty high. But I can certainly talk to you about where those boundaries are once I'm done with the presentation as well. And speaking of boundaries, Neighborhood Stabilization and Enhancement District. The new state law requires that the city designate or create these districts according to the state statute. Fortunately, the city was working on a very similar type project, a neighborhood scoring program that we were working on back in 2016 and 2017. And our GIS staff and our planners and Public Works and a bunch of other departments have come together to identify the best ways to identify blighted neighborhoods, blighted blocks in the city. We came up with several criteria, and the Rental Housing Advisory Board have kind of narrowed that down to 5 different criteria. The proposed criteria that we have before us right now, and those are on the big maps here in the room, that would be code enforcement cases. Those would be cases where we did find violations that were called into the inspections division. Police calls for crimes against property, police calls for crimes against persons, and then we have assessor data regarding housing conditions, because assessors do go out regularly to assess conditions, and then the location of foreclosures. So those 5 criteria is what the Rental Housing Advisory Board has been looking at for the last month or 2. And then that could be forwarded to the City Council based on their recommendation where these districts could be created. In general, the maps show the concentration of where the highest violations are of all these criteria. And when you get over to the maps, maybe after my presentation, you can see we've also identified some of the blocks that have the highest concentrations of these violations that you can see that are in the central city, on the north side and the south side. And that's just a small version of the bigger maps here, so you know which map to look for here in the room. And then inspection option number 3. That's something that we didn't really talk about much in 2017, but it's something that the city's actually doing already, exterior inspections of all properties. Right now, the city inspects the gateway corridors into the city, which are the major streets, highways that lead into Oshkosh. That's usually, it's going to be South Park, 9th, Algoma, Oshkosh Avenue, Jackson, and Main Street. Those are the examples of those principal arterials, those highways that lead in. That's something every few months the city inspectors go up and down those corridors looking for violations, and especially I call them the unforgivables, the long grass, the junk and debris that's piling up, and the parked vehicles on grass. Those are the some that we identify quite frequently, but we also identify property maintenance and nuisance codes. These could be expanded to include other neighborhoods. Right now it's just the gateways, and we've been doing that for 3 or 4 years. You could expand that to a different district or a different neighborhood, depending on the choice the city wants to make regarding that. That fee schedule follows a different fee schedule a little bit. So you can see it's still no dollars for the first inspection, and no dollars if it's corrected. As you can see, it escalates up to the 4th inspection where it's not corrected. Then it gets all the way up to $300. But once it's corrected, that inspection is $0. This one has a fiscal impact of about $75,000. More revenue could be generated because the fees are recovered, but not all the costs. The neighborhood impact could actually be a little more significant in that exterior violations are corrected and often can address neighborhood or neighborhood association concerns. And there's actually more property maintenance and nuisance violations that are corrected rather than just the habitability code that we would inspect the rental units for. On the downside, there would be no interior inspections, so none of the health and safety from the checklist would necessarily be covered except for the just 4 or 5 exterior inspection items. None of the interior would be covered, so no plumbing, no carbon monoxide detectors, no interior stairs, nothing with plumbing or anything like that. So those are the 3 options. I want to highlight the Polco. That's a citizen engagement tool that the city has used. It's really easy to use because I've gone to the site. It seems to be pretty easy to get to. Collects input like a survey. There's the www.polco.us/Oshkosh, and it's online right now. It'll stay online through October 9th, and the results will be reported to the Rental Housing Advisory Board, and I'm sure that would be forwarded on to the City Council once it is tallied up as well. And I got a screenshot of what that Polco survey looks like. As you can see, it just says the City of Oshkosh is considering 3 options for the updated rental inspections program. Which of the following would you recommend? Complaint-based is the one I mentioned that we're doing right now that we'd continue to do because we respond to all complaints within the city. But then the other 2 is the tenant approved within a designated area, and then the other is the exterior inspections, similar to our gateway inspections, again within designated areas within the city. Mr. Steinerson.
Yeah, and then the first option, the complaint-based, wouldn't go away whether or not the other options were taken.
Correct. Complaint-based, I think the city's like the do nothing. You're going to have to respond to complaints.
Yep.
Mr. Davis, question kind of going back to slide number, looks like 6 on option number 2, where we were talking about tenants inviting the landlord to the inspection. You know, checklist has been distributed. What, if anything, would we be looking at, or what a tenant be looking at in that scenario if there were landlord retaliation consequences for their consent? Would we be referring them out to state statute and their own legal counsel? Is that something the city really can even do anything with?
Right now, the city provides a pamphlet to the tenant that says these are the other housing support services that the city can't offer. And if you're talking legal, that's something the city doesn't do. That would be something that we have connections. Off the top of my head, I didn't bring that with. I wish I did at this point. But I want to say DATCAP has a contact, as well as I think the students on campus have a legal aid type of position. And I believe there's might be other resources out there, but those are the only two off the top of my head. And we do have a flyer for that I think we've distributed at the farmers market, and we have online, and we can make that available to everybody.
And then one other follow-up to that, and that is, on the other end of things, what if these correction notices, and we've talked about this previously, this is more for benefit of people viewing, if the correction is actually a tenant fault and not, while the landlord owns the property and he's still responsible, but do tenants at times get fined or notices or correction because of something like parking on grass?
That would, Mr. Zarate has dealt with that
Right, and so
regularly.
parking on the grass is about the only one that we can give to the tenants because we can identify the license plate. Otherwise, it's, it's gotta go, it goes to the landlord, it's gotta go to the property owner, the other service fee type inspections that we do.
Any other questions or comments from the Rental Housing Advisory Board?
Mr. Davis, can you isolate the place on the inspection checklist which allows inspectors to violate a tenant's Fourth Amendment rights? Because I've been hearing a lot about that, right, that inspectors will just snoop or dig beyond the scope of the checklist, but I don't see that on here. I'm kind of confused. Where is that allowed?
I'm at a loss to respond to that one because the tenants actually have to designate what they allow us to inspect. As an example, if there's two people who share a unit and one invites the inspector in, we can inspect the common areas and we can inspect one of the tenant's bedrooms, but if the other tenant isn't there, we don't go in the bedroom of the tenant that's not there unless we get permission. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we even get written permission when we have that opportunity.
We have them sign the form before we even enter the house.
Mr. Davis, excuse me, I have a couple of things here. Going back to page 6, could you just please explain to folks who may not be aware what the Neighborhood Stabilization and Enhancement District or districts are?
Good question. I'm sorry I went over that. The legislature created, gave the city the opportunity to create neighborhoods or districts where we would apply any kind of inspection program. The Neighborhood Stabilization and Enhancement District is not in state statute. That's what I'm just calling it, just to give people an idea what the goals are with the program. That's still identifying a geography or a neighborhood or a group of blocks where the city would want to apply this type of inspection program. So we're using data from a lot of different sources to identify the blocks where we think we need to do this the most, and then the Rental Housing Advisory Board would have to recommend that to the council, and the council would actually create that as part of the ordinance saying, we're designating this neighborhood. I call it a Neighborhood Stabilization and Enhancement District. I'm not married to that name.
I think in other communities, sometimes they're called like neighborhood improvement districts.
Yep.
There's a variety of
names that we could use to apply to that district. But we think that's what the state code was directing us to do, to create those districts.
Okay, great. And then on page 7, the housing inspection checklist. I know that they can pick up a copy here, but for people who may not be here, is this inspection checklist online where someone can access it?
Yeah.
Yes, it is. If you visit the Community Development Inspections Division, the Rental Housing contact information, the checklist, all kinds of material is there for the tenants and the landlord's education.
Okay, thank
In
you.
fact, I believe the checklist was available before the program even rolled out, correct?
Well, we did mail that out to all landlords in the city when we first started the contact program. So that was our attempt to educate all landlords at least. Tenants usually don't get that until we're there to do the inspection.
Okay.
But it's certainly available 24/7 on the city's website.
Okay, I knew it was at one time, but then the city went through some website enhancements
Oh,
and
yes.
so forth, and I just wanted to make sure that it was still there
well,
and hadn't been accidentally
I can
dropped.
tell you, Inspections Division tried to make sure it was there, but we're not IT people, so sometimes it gets lost.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Zari, can I just ask you a quick question on here? I'm not seeing it, but it's kind of small print and these glasses aren't the best. So I've had a few people contact me asking questions like, I rent, my landlord, I contacted my landlord, the stove doesn't work or the oven doesn't heat up or whatever. Is there anything that we look at in this list or beyond related to appliances that were supplied in the rental of the unit?
Right, so where that comes in is that is a complaint-based one. That does not fall under the rental inspection program. The rental inspection program is only covering kind of the life safety issues. So we're limited in scope to that checklist for that program. If there is a complaint-based inspection that we do because the tenant is having problems with an appliance or bad flooring or whatever, that falls into the city's housing code for rentals. And if it doesn't work, then that's one of the violations from the city's housing code, but that is not part of the rental program.
So these are really directed at health, human safety,
Right.
and public welfare.
Right, yep.
And all these items are derived from state code, essentially, correct? Like the city housing code is in line with state codes.
The city adopts the state's building code. I'm not sure I could pick out where in the state statute these are. Maybe Mr.
Right.
Zarate knows.
Well, I think what we've looked at there is we've identified what they consider to be habitability violations, and that was what that list is compromised of. I mean, your stove doesn't work, that doesn't mean you can't live there. I mean, you could still live there safely, it's just that your stove doesn't work, your refrigerator doesn't work. I mean,
Although with some appliances like the water heater and the furnace, I think those are habitability,
would be.
and those would be on the list. But air conditioning, I don't think is.
correct.
Any other questions from the Rental Housing Advisory Board? Otherwise, I'd suggest we could open it up to the audience for questions and answers. And as a reminder, if you could come up to the podium and state your name and address, and we'd be happy to attempt to answer questions.
And also, if we could just get those packets of information back,
Oh,
just in case anyone needs them.
Oh, my fault.
Thank you very much. If anyone needs any packets, they're up here.
Mr. Lord, I thought I saw your hand up. Whoever.
Sure. I just got a couple questions. Don Lord, and should I give my address?
Yes, please.
743 West 10th. One of the questions I had is, you have to ask permission now for both the exterior and the interior on rental properties, is that correct? You have to ask the tenant for both of those?
We'll ask the tenant for the interior and do the exterior at the same time.
Okay.
If
I
the
just-
tenant, we're not going to just do the exteriors.
Okay,
We'd always get the tenant's permission for the interior, and since we're at the site, we'd also do the exterior.
okay. But you don't have, you have to ask permission for any inspection, is that correct?
That's my interpretation of the rental inspection.
Right, yeah, I think just to even enter the property at all, step foot on the property, we'd have to have permission for that.
Then the other question was, I see the, the citywide, are you gonna have to ask permission to do that? Or when you go citywide of everything of the exteriors, do you have to ask permission for that, or can you just go ahead and do that?
The exterior only, which we use for the gateways, we stay on public right-of-way.
Okay,
So we stay on the sidewalk or the street, and those are what we can see from the street.
But if you expanded that to the whole city, you could do the whole city without having to ask permission. Is that correct or not?
That is correct. We could, the right of way is available to anybody, and
Okay.
other communities actually already do this. We've just chosen to select those corridors. In theory, we could do it citywide, or we could pick a different neighborhood. We don't have to just do the corridors. In fact, the council could say, we want these corridors and not those corridors, or we want more corridors, or anything like that.
I just wanted to bring up the one point I made at the last advisory board, is that so much of this is reactive, and I'm hoping to be a little more proactive in that I asked for, and I think this is going to happen, the 10 most common violations, which is probably going to make up the majority of the violations, and how we can prevent and correct those situations proactively, I would think would be a very good idea, particularly if you're doing this citywide inspection. And even if we could, I'd be willing to help, like make a YouTube video or something of that nature proactively. And in fact, if you do a certain area that you deem blighted, or however you put it, you know, so other people that would really want to do their property even outside of the blighted area might have a handle on that beforehand.
One of the areas of emphasis for the Rental Housing Advisory Board is education, so I expect the Rental Housing Advisory Board will want to do some kind of education, both landlord and tenant related, for these types of issues.
And as you well know, the Apartment Association is very
Interested in helping.
Education seminars. In fact,
Yep.
we're holding one in spring again at the convention center. Maybe that'd be a good opportunity to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Ron, if you want to go up.
Ron Hanchy, 52 Eveline Street, and I'm representing the Stevens Park Neighborhood Association. A couple of questions relative to this new program. Can the city furnish the Stevens Park Neighborhood Association a listing of all of the rental properties in our area?
We can provide all the public record that's available, and we would have the contacts for and the locations for all the rental properties that have registered with us. Yes.
Okay. So we could get a list of those that have registered, or can we get a list of all of the properties that are rental?
I'm not sure. We can certainly give you the list of the registered. I'm not sure who you're asking for on
Any rental property in the Stevens Park neighborhood.
Yes, that we
Okay,
can do.
if they're registered.
Oh, only if they're registered. If they don't register, we don't know about it.
Well, sure you do. The tax records indicate it.
Assessor.
Well, we've had that.
We've tried that.
Well, so, and we've had the people that have a house out of state, and they live in Oshkosh in the summer, and they live in Arizona in the winter, and we've sent those out, and they're like, oh, that's our summer home. We don't rent that out. And so we get that, or that's where my son or daughter lives. That's not a rental. So we have to believe that we sent out the notices, register your rental properties if it is a rental property, and we sent that out to everyone just by, like you said, checking the tax roll. And if the mailing address did not match the actual building address, we considered it a rental, and that's what we went off of to determine if that was a rental or not.
Okay, can the Stevens Park Neighborhood Association receive that list that you sent out?
Definitely.
Yeah, that's all public record on the assessor's website. Yep.
Well, we'd have to go through it.
No, we can run that's all existing information. I think they can run a report.
Oh, okay.
And I'll just.
Because we have a great interest in rental in the Stevens Park Neighborhood Association. I'm not sure, but I think like 40 to 50% of the properties are rental. A lot of them are owner-occupied duplexes that they rent out. And some of them maintain them, and some of them don't. And some of them are in bad shape. When you form the districts, can you work with a neighborhood association to form that district or not?
We can work with all the community to form those districts, and any input that you could provide to staff or the Rental Housing Advisory Board or the council, I'm sure would be very well received.
Okay, because we're very interested in the rental properties to maintain the value of the properties in the Stevens Park Neighborhood Association.
And that's been a common comment I've gotten from numerous neighborhood associations over the years.
Thank you.
I saw another hand on that side.
We can supply it off the assessor's data.
Jay Kraus, 1252 Jackson. I've lived in this city for approximately 30 years. When I moved into my house, there was a lot of upkeep. I took care of it. Rental housing was about 18%. Up to this current year, I believe we're hitting 50% of rental on Jackson alone. Not all of the problem is on rentals. The majority of it is with unkept housing, cars on the lawn, you've named it, you've seen it. I was wondering if any of this could be passed on to the private residences that are also in need of, we call it deferred maintenance. What you can do about that. Also in a program like this where the city of Oshkosh is looking to boost its revenues by levying license or wheel tax fees, by increasing the property values, you would think you wouldn't have to shaft the little citizens on the smaller things, that you'd create revenue by increased property values and appearance. And also I noticed that option 3, exterior inspections only, kind of conflicts with number 2, doesn't it? Even if the gateway properties that are rental are on the gateway, no exterior only, but on inspection option 3, exterior inspections of all properties.
Let me give you an example on Jackson, because that would be one of the
that'd be great.
neighborhoods.
Thank you.
If there's a complaint on Jackson from a tenant, we'll do that investigation, and if there's violations, we'd work with the landlord to get those corrected. That'll continue today and tomorrow and in the future is my expectation. If we do the exterior only, I don't think anything changes on Jackson since that's already a corridor. We're already checking to make sure that that rental unit plus the owner occupied plus the next rental unit meet at least the exterior inspection requirements we have. We don't do anything with the interiors on those corridors. It's just the exteriors. So you could get in, that property could get 2 inspections, one with a tenant complaining and one with exterior with the inspectors staying on the sidewalk or from the right-of-way.
Can a citizen give a tip?
We do follow up on all tips. They can be anonymous, they can be with name and address, and everything in between.
A little more city participation might boost some property values. Last assessment, I cited 20 properties around my neighborhood that dropped 12%. Now, I know what a paintbrush and a lawnmower look like, and guess whose went up? 14%. I don't see where that's justified if you want to boost your revenue just by enforcing the appearance outside would do a number. I have taken guests around the city, touring them, and I get the comment, what a dump. I'm sorry to say that, but it's the absolute truth. It should be going through the whole city and not just singled out to the rentals. More people need to get off their butt and maintain their property, and rather than drag their neighborhood down with them.
That would be similar to option 3.
Option 3 would be great citywide. So I'll quit my ranting and raving, but I wanted to thank you for allowing me to get the opinion.
Thank you. Who else? Yes. Yes.
This is a stereotype. I'm looking like a dump.
Hi, I am Vicki Shorsey, and I live at 1224 Algoma Boulevard in the historic district for the Algoma Boulevard neighborhood. And I am representing the Sawyer Payne Neighborhood Association. And we started, one of our projects that we decided was a priority was dealing with rental signage that has been growing, especially on Elmwood. And then all of the issues that come from that. I also am recently a new county board member, so I went door to door, so I learned all sorts of things as I did that. And I don't have a lot of questions, but I had a few comments that I'd like to share just as feedback, and then I do have a suggestion for another thing to consider at the end. First of all, just from a philosophy perspective, we do understand that a good neighborhood includes rental owners and their tenants. as well as the single-family property owners. So we have a great respect for both parties and the interests of both parties and want to make it a win-win situation. Aesthetics of rental property and tenant behaviors are an important part of building a good neighborhood. And so if we can work together, we can help landlords as well as them helping us to build that good neighbor culture. And one of the issues that really struck me, and I was kind of on a rant about it for a while, was that as I looked at what was happening on Elmwood, that has traditionally been the kind of homeowner that was either a startup homeowner. We had a lot of young families in those houses, and then we had older people that were middle income or lower middle income that were, had good experiences and stayed in that neighborhood for a long, long time. And when all of the signs started going up on the properties, I really saw it as an issue of an unfair market advantage, because as those signs go up, that labels that neighborhood. So as a property owner in that neighborhood, it would be a concern to me because that would probably drop my property rates. Although I understand that some of the landlords will come in and offer over market so they can acquire that neighborhood. So, but I guess underlying it all is the issue of property values and maintaining and growing those property values. In the historic district, we have invested tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars in renovating those houses and, restoring them back to their historic or their period, or, just making them a better property. At one time, that whole neighborhood was on the way down, and the university had plans to tear down the historic homes. So we just like to say, the landlords' property values and the single-family homeowners' property values are of equal importance, and everyone needs to, from a philosophical perspective, understand that. We also, I especially, but a lot of our neighbors appreciate the good neighbor standards that are being sent out. I don't know which department it's coming from. I think it's the Go H&I people.
That is correct.
And I think that is a good thing, and even for landlords to communicate what behaviors you expect of your tenants. And that a lot of times it's just that a lot of people are coming into adulthood and don't understand what are acceptable. and property owners. We have, newer property owners coming in, and they don't understand a lawnmower and a paintbrush. So I think it's real important that as much communication and recognition of properties that really come around and become good neighbors. And that's tied in with my recommendation. And that is, and I'm a former fundraiser, so that's my view of the world. So, but the idea of recommending that we develop a recognition programs for landlords and have a criteria, and if they are in the community and meeting those criteria for becoming good neighbors, that we recognize that and they get some kind of recognition that will help them in the marketplace. We love the idea of moving everything to websites and taking all of that marketing, that commercial marketing signage off properties. And the reality is, if you're a renter or an owner, you're part of a neighborhood. And I think that should be, those signs should come down, and when people come to Oshkosh looking for a rental, they should go on the website and get their information there. So thank you very much for your excellent work. I've been watching it, and it's great, and thanks for this opportunity to share my thoughts.
And if I could, for the follow-up for the signage, that was actually an issue that the Rental Housing Advisory Board, I believe, is going to be taking up in December. We'll have our planning director, Darren Burrich, in attendance, so we can talk about the zoning code and the sign code and the constitutional issues related to that.
Yes, and we've been having several discussions with Steve. And
okay, one of our assistant planners.
Yeah, to Dan. And I guess we got to a point, and evidently there are other communities in New York State, Minneapolis. There are some areas where they have started moving everything to the web as opposed to having signs. Because we started out thinking smaller signs would be acceptable, but we don't need that. And everybody's using the web today to find a lot of things, and that is our preference. So everybody's part of the neighborhood, and there's not a distinguishment, but between whether you're a renter or a homeowner. So
Very
thank
good.
you very much.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Not as tall as you are. But I want to ditto everything that lady said. I live on Jackson Street. And
Can we get your
Jackson
name
Street-
and address, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. Chloe Wanschneider, 1609 Jackson Street. I'm going to repeat that I ditto everything that she said. It's just, we have the same philosophy going on with us. The signs are a real problem. But she talked about marketing, and I'm wondering, how closely do you work with the university in promoting rental facilities for the students? Stevens Point has an off-campus housing resource, and they've got a off-campus housing fair, and the landlords are there. They speak to the students, let them know what they have to rent and what expectations there are. Then they also, the Stevens Point Police Department has a brochure that they hand out to the students, how to be a good neighbor. And it's a guide to city ordinances and Wisconsin laws. The brochure lists information about bicycles, motor vehicle parking, parties, social hosting, chronic nuisances, and other typical ordinance violations. Now Stevens Point still has these young students staying on campus for 2 years. I don't think I'm wrong, but I think the University of Wisconsin has reduced it that they only have to stay on campus 1 year. And this causes a problem. These kids are just out of high school, and they're not qualified to live on their own. And our houses and in hers, these are historic homes, and they are just being totally, totally ruined. We're an old lumber city. We've got virgin timbers in there, and you just see these stuff flying out of that house. The landlords come and rip it apart, turn anything into a bedroom. It's just horrible. And if you want a gateway, you certainly don't want what's happening. So, also, I wanted to know the rental inspection and complaints in Oshkosh. It states that the city of Oshkosh has a minimum housing code in effect to prevent the deterioration of residential units and neighborhoods and to ensure a minimum level of housing standards for the residents of the city. Why is it at a minimal level? Why is it not at a higher level? Because that's exactly what we're turning our city into, a minimal living city. The quality of life is just disappearing. And when you have, there are some cities that they have rental properties, they have to be 150 feet apart. And you know what we've got on on Jackson Street, our lots are 47 feet wide. And when you have, these are really that close, and these are kids that are just too immature to be living in these homes. So I do want to know why we have a minimum standard. Now in the state of Michigan, they're taking theirs. I want to know if this is applicable to us. It says in Michigan, clearly, under federal law, a community has a right to inspect a rental unit, but must obtain an administrative warrant if the tenant refuses entry. And do we do that? If the tenant refuses, then do we get that warrant?
The city of Oshkosh can get a warrant, and rarely do we do that. We do that, but gotta be it's not very common. Mr. Zarate, I can't remember the last time we got a warrant for an inspection.
I've been in the city for 16 years, and I think we've done 2 of them.
Is it because you only had 2 tenants that refused to let you in, or is it only because the city decided to just get 2 warrants?
So with the cases that we had, we had to prove that to a judge that we had a reason to enter that property, showing them visible signs from the exterior of the house, a hole in the roof, maybe there was windows totally missing, maybe the foundation was collapsed, evidence from a social worker that had been in the house, showing some conditions inside of the house of some structural failure. Those are the kind of things that get us into the house. Our rental program was all voluntary. So if the tenants wanted us in, we came in. If they didn't, we went on to the next one.
Okay.
So our inspection program was not mandatory for the interior of the home.
Yeah. Now, Madison has a best practice thing, and what they do is, it's either Madison or Stevens Point, when a landlord is, like what you talked about marketing, if you can find landlords that are really superior, then they would get on a good list. And so, and the university's talking to students, they would say these are highly recommended, or they're on the best list of landlords, or however you want to recognize them. And that would give students more guidance too as to whom to rent from. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I can field the UWO question if that's okay.
good.
So, in the status quo, meaning the way things are now, the Oshkosh Student Association, which is the student government at Oshkosh, does provide some information on off-campus rental housing in the past, and I know they do have plans at some point to do some kind of housing fair. In the past, this board has provided that resource with brochures and literature, and it's also my understanding, though, that in terms of accessing those students right now, landlords can just kind of email them, send out email advertisements to their announcements list, and that's the way they get informed, I suppose.
May I respond to that? There's an email.
Could you please go back
yeah.
up to the podium then, please, ma'am? Thank you.
There's just an overload of emails, and when that comes through, that just kind of gets shut off. And I do think if you have that student fair and actually give them a physical brochure, that might help.
They do have one.
Yeah,
Okay.
they are doing a fair, and we don't, what we do, this board is not, is separate from the university administration, obviously. A lot of it has to do with, we have provided them information in the past, but as it pertains to which landlords they should use, I think they maintain a kind of website that the students can look at for listings, as well as I know the student paper has covered landlord-tenant issues in the past, so students are being informed. There's also, I last year taught it's called a Rent Smart class on campus to any students who wanted to help prepare them to rent in the future. So those resources are present to some extent. Those initiatives are accessible.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And Ms. Ernst, isn't Rent Smart also available to landlords as well as tenants?
Correct. Generally, the Rent Smart is a free course offered by the UW Extensions. The one I taught on campus last year was just for students, though. But yeah, any landlord or tenant can take that class.
My name is Barbara Springup. I rent at 112 West 14th Avenue in Oshkosh. I'm not a college kid. I'm not a youngster. Oshkosh is very hard to rent with pets. I have a dog and a cat. I pay $65 a month for a non-fenced yard. I've been the practice manager of vet offices. I've run humane societies. I know pets. But when I try to rent something in Oshkosh, it's astronomical. Even if I just want a 2-bedroom off campus, it's between $800 and $1,000 plus. I can go to Fond du Lac and get it for $495 to $750. The rents are really high, even if you're not a student, when you're splitting 5 bedrooms and 10 people. I'm not a child. I'm in my 50s. I rented from a family-owned small organization in Oshkosh, which is pretty small compared to Milwaukee. I thought, oh, it's family-owned. They're going to treat me well. What a fool. I should have gotten it in writing. When I toured it, I was promised things. When I inspected, I was promised things. I had 7 days to hand stuff in. I was promised things. It's 2 years later. I'm in a horrendous place. If I make a complaint, the landlord can retaliate, and I have to hire my own lawyer and fight it. If I make a complaint and my house is condemned, which it probably will be, where am I going? Where am I finding a place in Oshkosh with 24 hours and a dog and a cat? What are the resources available to me? Not a darn thing. My house should be condemned. My dog is licking varnish off the floor. I have squirrels in the attic. I can go on, but I can't make a complaint. Because I'm screwed in this. I'm either going to get it from the landlord, or I'm screwed and I have no place to live, and I'm on the street with a dog and a cat. Shouldn't be punished because I have pets. I'm a good landlord. I'm a good tenant. I'm a good employee. But you're not doing me any favors. Get in there and inspect everything. Everything. 5 years, ridiculous. 3 year. You should be in there every 3 years. I know it takes more manpower, but we are in a mess. Thank you.
Ma'am, if you contact the local Humane Association, they have a list of landlords who are favorable to renting to pets.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would encourage you to do that. Are you at this time asking the city to inspect your property?
No, I declined it. I called and asked questions, and I declined it because I am at risk.
Okay.
And I have nowhere to go.
All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Todd Hutchison. I live at 2536 Fond du Lac Road in Oshkosh. I'm not sure what, and I know that this woman just said that you should inspect all the properties every 3 years, but I'm not exact. First of all, my understanding is that anyone can file a complaint. Is that correct?
Yes.
Anyone. I mean, city official, me as a private citizen, a neighbor, a neighborhood group can get together and they can file a complaint. You can file a complaint anonymously. Right?
Yes.
And then the city has to follow up on
Investigate.
it,
Yep.
investigate on that. And so I'm not sure why you wouldn't file the complaint anonymously, and then the city comes in and does the inspection. And so it seems like that can always happen. If you have a complaint, or if somebody sees a complaint, they just file the complaint, and the city acts on that complaint and inspects it. On option number 2, you have to get the tenant's authorization to let you in, right? Well, in this case, the tenant won't let you in. So I don't understand, and you're only getting in on 5 to 15% of the inspections. So those tenants didn't have a problem with it, and if they had an issue in their unit, they would have called and complained and then let you in. But if they're, I mean, I understand and I get your complaint and your concern, but that seems like something separate, like some sort of law. And maybe, I think, in fact, I think there is a law against landlord retaliation. So there already is that law against that. And yes, you'd have to fight it, but there are also legal aid. I mean, I haven't been here that long, but generally there are legal aid associations that will help tenants that can't afford an attorney to fight that battle with the landlord if there is retaliation. So I guess I'm not, I haven't been involved in this very long, but I just don't understand what the whole number 2 is solving. It seems like it's using an elephant gun to take care of something that if we have tenant associations that are concerned about their neighborhood And I know, I'm from Milwaukee, and I know that the tenant associations down there are good ones, there are bad ones, there are very active ones. The very active ones, they put together a list, they get their neighbors together, and they walk down the street, and they write up code violations, and they send it in. And the very best neighborhood associations will first talk to the owners of those properties and try and work with them to get it resolved. If they are obstinate, then it goes right to the city writes up violations, and the landlord or the owner. And I guess that's the second point, is that I'm also, and I think this was brought up elsewhere, I'm not sure why this is targeted just towards rental properties. To me, I would agree it should be citywide, and it should be owner-occupied and rental inspection properties, because there are a lot of owner-occupied properties that aren't maintained as well. And so I think if there's complaints, then maybe it's more organized, and if it's focused on city inspectors driving down targeted areas that you want to deal with, the complaints go out and they have to be investigated and taken care of. So I guess I don't get what number 2 is solving for all of that. I guess that's it. Thank you.
Paul Schmidt, 1025 Bayshore Drive. First of all, this program is not a state mandate. Is that correct?
The rental inspection is not a state mandate.
So this is something that's available to the city, and has the council adopted this program?
They adopted one last year, but
Yeah.
we have to update it based on the state law change, so we've suspended that until Rental Housing Advisory Board makes a recommendation, and the council still has to decide whether they want to continue or modify the program or eliminate the program.
Okay, so it hasn't been adopted yet. This
Correct.
is just a proposal at this point. Okay. Inspection option number 2 on page 5. You made a comment about the city will send a letter to the tenant. I didn't understand that.
Yes, based on the information we have, we send the tenant, I don't remember how it's addressed, but it goes to the occupant of the structure, the unit, and then it's up to the recipient to actually contact the city to arrange for the inspection. Do you recall how it's addressed, Mr. Zarate?
I mean, that's pretty much, that summarizes what it is. I don't remember the exact language, but that's what it is. So we're contacting, hopefully, the tenant or that occupant within that.
Well, why are you sending this letter to the tenant? I'm not getting that.
That's what's mandated by state statute. We cannot contact the landlords for entry.
Okay, so this is only for contacting the tenant so you can gain access to the property?
Correct.
Is that what you're saying? You're not randomly sending out letters throughout the city to tenants saying, hey, you got some problems, let us know?
No, we picked the certain geography. We started around the campus, and that's the middle maps on both these displays. That's where we started this last year. We wanted to start in the campus area.
Okay, but again, you're not randomly just sending out letters to these tenants.
Well, it's block by block. I mean, it's not
we're
like...
sending out the letter to each block because we figured that's the block we're gonna do the next week or the next 30 days. So we would send that letter to that block of tenants in those homes saying, hey, we're gonna be in your neighborhood in the next 30 days. Please contact us to set up an inspection.
Okay. Page 6, rental housing inspection process. The tenant may invite the landlord. What's the rationale behind the landlord not being allowed in his own property while the inspection's going on?
That's entirely up to the tenant, is what our legal direction has been. The tenant as the controlling interest as to who's invited onto the property. We can't invite anybody, I can't invite anybody else onto the tenant's property. The tenant has the final say as to who's allowed on the property.
But I own the property
Then
as a landlord. So Are you prohibiting me from being there?
No, we don't prohibit anybody. We just
Okay.
can't authorize you to.
Okay. Do I know when this inspection is being done as the owner of the, or the landlord or property manager of this property?
Only if the tenant tells you.
Okay. So if I were to happen to show up while you're doing this inspection and the tenant said, I don't want him in here, I would not be allowed in my own property.
You wouldn't be allowed without notice anyway.
Excuse me?
You wouldn't be allowed in without prior notice anyway. Under state law, landlords require 12-hour, or it's required the landlord provide at least 12 hours notice to enter a tenant's dwelling, except in the case of an emergency.
That's correct.
Or unless the tenant.
Or unless the tenant specifically
Yes.
invites the landlord in. So if
Or
you show,
waives that 12 hours.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, that is correct. I just find that rather selfish, I guess, for lack of a better word. If you do exterior inspections, will you be looking at getting into the property with the owner, if it's owner occupied in the gateway areas?
We have never done that.
Or
only exterior.
Or will you, if you're doing inspections in your districts that you've selected, will you be asking the tenants then get inside to do interior inspections?
The exterior inspections have really no overlap with the rentals. The exteriors only doesn't follow the rental housing state statute. That's something the city does independent of that. And nobody's asked for entry into any of the units, owner or renter occupied.
And then I just wanted to piggyback on I was thinking along the same line about what the prior lady said about, we have a minimum housing code in the city of Oshkosh. So is this in any means, I probably know the answer, but that's the question. Is this any means of a double standard that we're now being faced with, where we have the minimum housing code plus the rental housing inspections?
The inspections are based on the housing code, is what I remember.
Yeah, anything that's on that list would also be on the housing code, but the housing code has things over and above what is on the list.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Zarate, maybe you can just share a little bit about what was found in the target area that was inspected when we had our program. My understanding was like there was 100% violations, or can you?
Oh, on those numbers?
Yes, and the numbers, yeah.
Of the interior inspections that were conducted, which was the number between 5 to 10%, yeah, 100% of those dwellings, of those rental units had violations, and on average, I think it was a 5 or 6 on average violations per rental unit.
And that's safety
Right, and those were life
violations.
safety. Those are the things that were on the checklist. And so when we're in there, we're only doing those checklist items. It had been brought up before, an example, in the city's housing code, if there's appliances that are included in your rent and the stove isn't working, that isn't part of the rental inspection program checklist. That is part of the city's minimum rental housing code. And that we can take under separate issue through a complaint base, but that wouldn't be something that we're looking for during our rental inspection program.
And how many of those violations were fixed?
I believe we had all of the violations corrected. Most of them, I want to say, probably about 90% of those were corrected within the first 30 days.
Thanks.
Hi, Kieran Youngbecker for Alexander and Bishop, 300 North Main. I represent a lot of the campus area. Sorry, guys. So my big question is, we have quite a few co-signers. I would say 75% of our residents have a parent or somebody as a co-signer. Going under option one, sorry, whatever the resident approved entering.
That would be option 2,
Oh,
tenant
sorry,
approved.
option 2.
Yep.
And I don't know who here is a lawyer or if you've thought about that, but would the co-signer, who is technically part of the lease, have to sign off on that too, in terms of entering?
We've never discussed that with the
Throwing
attorney's
it out there
office.
as a concept of, again, a lot of times too, just as a manager, I feel like I can only fix what I know about, but when all of a sudden mom and dad come home or come over for the weekend and they're like, oh, your toilet doesn't work, blah, 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 they're all angry, but I haven't heard about it, so then it's like, you haven't done anything, but something just to kind of think about in terms of people who have co-signers, in terms of them signing off also on the inspection. While not technically a resident, part of the lease, I don't know.
If I can comment on that, or at least ask a question or two. One, I know we did run into at least one situation where we had a group of 3 or 4 that lived in a property. Three were okay with somebody, with an inspector coming in. After the initial inspection, turned out one of the other tenant who wasn't there at the time, or roughly Mrs. Roddy can give the specifics, but there was a similar situation where part of the tenants were okay with them coming in, part of the tenants weren't, and that does create an issue.
Right.
But two, clarifying a question, I guess, on your co-signers, are they a financial guarantor on it, or is it an actual, or is it a co-tenant? Because there is a difference.
They're the guarantor, so they're the financial
In that
component.
case,
So I'm not sure what kind of legal shenanigans that could bring up.
If Mr. Roddy wants to maybe talk about the experience we had with at least the one, or what we found out from legal and how,
again, just trying to have
handled
them sign off, because it's usually a parent who's out of town and.
That was a problem. So in that instance that we had there, where we had the 3 or 4 tenants and 3 out of the 4 allowed us in and the 4th one said no, we actually had to go to court unfortunately with the landlord. I mean, the landlord wanted us to get in there and he wanted to show us that the problem was fixed, but the tenants were telling us no.
Okay.
And so,
And just to kind of bring up a quagmire that hopefully will never happen, but how do you cover everyone's bases to make sure that we're not going to court?
Yeah, and that's what we're definitely looking to not do. That we don't want to go to court.
It's not fun
We
for
typically
anybody,
work
so.
very closely with the city's legal team to make sure we don't
Right,
end up
and
there.
again, just a lot of, especially in the campus area, people will have co-signers, so how that has to work into, if that would be the option that would be pursued, what you do. So, just something to.
Very good.
Think about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Zarate, in that situation where we did have to go to court, did that ever get resolved in court, or is it still in litigation?
I don't know that I can answer that. I'm not sure if that one ever did. I believe it did get eventually resolved. I believe that the landlord did eventually get us into that unit.
Okay.
I think that was maybe one there was a vacancy.
Okay, thank you.
And if I can just share a little retrospective from council's discussion when we first approved the citywide, many times after a tenant's completed their lease, they go month to month. A number of those folks came and said, I'm now month to month. If I make a complaint and I get evicted or retaliated against, even against statute, the legal folks at Legal Action provided us information that specifically said that retaliation is so difficult to prove, especially if it's a month-to-month, right? So what came first, the chicken or the egg? It really is about protecting the tenants in the situation where there are health and safety issues. it's not going in search of a boogeyman here. So that was part of the decision-making that went into this. Just sharing that retrospective.
Kathleen Prop, 1936 Hazel Street. Thank you for holding this meeting and explaining all this. And I just want to initially say, I don't have a prepared statement, I'm speaking for myself, that the city needs a strong, fair rental inspection ordinance. And I'm personally very sorry that the state legislature chose to tie our hands and then throw a noose over our head, or throw a noose around our neck so that we couldn't perhaps do the best ordinance. Having said that, I never was in favor of a city-wide inspection. I don't think anybody was. We were kind of forced into that if we wanted to do anything at all. So I think I understand option one. It's what we have now. And it's what very few tenants exercise the right to do because of what has been said tonight. Retaliation and intimidation. And I work with a family, I'm friends with a family that has experienced that kind of thing. So I know what happens. Inspection 2, though, is kind of new to me. I maybe haven't read enough about it. If the city council so chooses, if this board suggests and the city council chooses, they could set up one or more neighborhood stabilization districts. I think that's great. How are inspections, let's say you do that. You set up my block as a neighborhood inspection district. Then what?
Then we'd send out letters to the tenants that we know
To
of
all
and-
tenants?
To all tenants.
Okay.
And we'll follow up with the inspections who respond to us. The tenants still have to let us schedule the inspection, and then we'd still work with the landlord to get the code violations corrected. As I said before, we get a low percentage, so my expectation is we'd have to do that repeatedly over the years, since it's a 5-year cycle to actually get through the units. So it's not going to be a 1 year and done. I expect it's going to be multiple years of those types of letters going out.
Okay, so hopefully landlords would cooperate and would not exercise the kind of intimidation and lousy PR that they did last time. But let's say in my neighborhood I would have, there aren't very many rentals in my neighborhood, but I'm using that as an example. There would be 20 rental buildings or units. Let's say 2 chose to inspect, to have inspection, and were successful. What did you just say about years of follow-up? Year 1,
We got those 2.
you got
and I
those
would
2.
say-
Does that mean you have to wait 5 more years before you can get the rest, or can you continue
No.
to follow up?
We would continue to follow up. I anticipate we'd send out a letter annually to the other 18 then. And
Oh,
then
okay.
if it's 2 more the next year, then it's 16 the next year. And then eventually we'll start the whole 5-year cycle, and there's some units we would not get into.
Okay, yeah. No, I understand that.
Can I say one thing?
I don't understand why tenants wouldn't want to have a safe, habitable structure with appliances that work, plumbing that works, no holes in the floor, minor things like that. That the rest of us would not, if we could help it, put up with at all. And of course, it goes back to if landlords would think ahead and be willing to do this, we wouldn't have this problem, because the units would all be more or less safe, habitable. They might be shabby, they might be ugly,
And in
but they would be safe. So
And certainly while the unit is vacant, the landlord could arrange for that inspection independent of any letter that we'd want to send out to the tenants. And the legislature actually gave them kind of an incentive that if they would have to pay fees, the vacant units pay less fees than the occupied units in inspection fees. So
Okay.
the legislature included that as kind of a carrot for landlords.
Okay, well, it makes sense. I used to own some rental property in another community, and when the property's vacant, that's the perfect time to inspect it. Then you make changes, you make repairs as needed. You're not inconveniencing the tenant. Okay, then I think on that basis, I'm definitely in favor of option 2. And I think I heard that appropriate neighborhoods or districts would be established based on various criteria that are being developed already.
Mm-hmm.
Code violations and all that kind of thing.
Yes. That's what we're attempting to do with the big maps.
Yeah.
That I can go through that in detail after maybe the open session here.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much.
Ms. Prop, can I ask a question of you?
Sure.
Right here. I know you've
Can't hear very well in the back.
you've served obviously in city government. You're active in our administration with different boards and commissions and in the community.
I'm on the Plan Commission.
Yep. And so I have a question, and because I've floated the idea, what is your thoughts? And I hate to put you on the spot, but I'm going to. Obviously, we're talking about neighborhood stabilization districts, or just creating specific areas to target, specific areas to improve. What's your thoughts on being able to use one inspection program in one area and a different inspection program in another? For example, if we identify, I know a lady earlier brought it up, maybe there's a neighborhood association that has identified an area that, or we identify an area based upon different criteria, police calls, code violations, things like that, nuisance issues that we know of. If we so choose, what do you think of that? What are your thoughts on using two different types of inspection programs within the same city? Right. Is that okay?
Classic. I'd want to know what the programs were. What the criteria were.
Yeah.
Option 1, these 5 criteria. Option 2, these 7 criteria.
Okay.
So I guess I'd want to know before I said yes or no. It's obviously got to be fair to everybody. So I'm not adverse to that. My goal is if landlords are not going to improve their property, I want to see them inspected for these basic things that are on this list.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So if that would improve that, and if it's legal to have neighborhood associations walk through and literally identify, a number of homes, but that's an exterior inspection. Exterior, I think, is important. But to me, what's really important is interior. You can have some peeling paint on the outside, and Plan Commission talks about wanting to have siding look nice, on all sides of the house. We did that this afternoon. But that's not the most important thing to me. The most important thing is a safe interior for people. So I'm open to it, and if the Rental Advisory Board wants to invite the Plan Commission to a workshop, talk about stuff like that, since we're in charge of ordinances like that, I'm sure we'd be happy to.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Can I?
Yes.
So, to get back to the option 2 question she had about inspections, to clarify for me and for everyone else, once an inspection is done in that property, then it starts the 5-year cycle that it can't be inspected again?
Correct.
So, if your property is inspected, it won't be inspected again, even if it's in that district for another 5 years.
Correct, unless there's a complaint.
Unless there's a complaint.
Yep.
And the other units, though, there still will be an attempt to contact the tenant to continue to inspect those locations.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, so it'll be a rolling type of thing that we're gonna have to follow each and every parcel so that they get their 5 years.
Right.
Just
That's the way I interpret state law at this point.
a quick question, Mr. Davis. Is there a scenario in which a combination of 2 and 3 would be feasible?
That was going to be
Yes.
my question.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that was my thought too. Was all 3 of them can be done simultaneously, or 2, or whatever combination of them.
Yes, that's my understanding. That's my belief.
Okay.
So is that something that we would be taking up at our next meeting, or?
Yes, October and November, or whenever you'd want to take action on that. Yes.
As long as we have time to legally notice it,
Yes.
correct?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Is
Do
there
we have
anybody else
other-
in
we
the
have
public?
Other folks from the public that would like to speak to this?
Yes, Mr. Mayor.
If there's no one coming forward, I just make a couple of comments that, so everyone, I think everyone at the table knows my role or involvement in this whole thing going back a number of years. Many in the audience probably do too, but this is not an Oshkosh issue only. Every city, every village in the state has the same problem. I made many trips to Madison, testifying with the legislatures, meeting with the legislatures. I was there with people from Milwaukee and people there from Turtle Lake, Wisconsin. And Turtle Lake, I had to get a map and see where Turtle Lake was. Same issue. The cities are all working together. You know, our ordinance here is pretty much going to be the one that most cities follow. We're dealing with a lot of communities, you know, the Stevens Points, the Manitowocks, and so forth. But this is not only an Oshkosh issue. It affects the entire state of Wisconsin.
And I'd just like to follow up with that. We have some really responsible and really good landlords in Oshkosh. It's unfortunate that a few who are not so responsible are out there. You know, recently the police department did this lip sync challenge video thing, which was interesting. I guess my thought would be, you know, what if the landlords took the Rent Smart class and made a webinar series and, you know, some how-to, not saying you got to go to a lip sync challenge level, but, you know, those really responsible and respected landlords in the community do set that example. And while the legal jargon of minimum housing code and all of that is what's in our ordinances, you know, we really do want these neighborhoods of choice, and we do want folks to get along. So it would be really, really appreciated if those of you who, you know who you are, you know who the good ones are, you know, just maybe did a little mentoring. I realize there are some that are just not going to be reached. It does take that stick instead of the carrot, but that's just my commentary.
I've just addressed what you said. Don Lord again. You know, I listened to what you had to say, and I do think sometimes it would be a really good idea if we did have something that, even a logo that certain landlords could use in their ads and things. And at different times I thought there would be a good idea to have an education component that people would, you know, take different landlord training courses, and that would be part of that. And we have several courses actually, I don't know what do you want to call it, that are in the can, you know, that you can actually, it's just a matter of me getting permission or having to pay some money to use them, that actually for training landlords. So I really think that would be a good idea, and I do like the idea of somehow maybe there'd be a way that you could accredit you know, some people, you know, in some fashion. Yeah.
Mr. Lord, we've talked about this in the past. For those landlords who own several rental properties or dozens, can you see a scenario in which our community landlords would actually start encouraging tenants to form these tenant associations as a communication tool with the landlord community?
Well, you know, one of the problems I have and my frustration is getting participation from anybody. Landlord or tenant, I personally, you know, I've had these conversations where I actually had, you know, courses on landlord-tenant law, and I think I'll probably sponsor one again next year. And we had 75 people come, and of that 75, only 5 were tenants, and it was geared to tenants. So a lot of times what happens is people don't do prep work until there's a problem. That's why I'm always talking about being proactive, because, you know, they don't read their paperwork till they have a problem, or some of these other things. In the Rent Smart, I help teach a section of that, a little portion of that, and I think that's a good program. Somehow that seems to, somehow the most of the people that there are people that have had problems in the past, and then they get a certificate to help them find, you know, units again. And one of the things I want to address, the lady that left with the dogs, you know, we also have to encourage people to invest in Oshkosh. Right now we have a vacancy rate that's in the 3s, which is much lower than the state and federal level, which is also causing pretty good size increases in rent. And so most of the phone calls I get now are people just looking for affordable places to rent. You used to always hear about, my landlord took this out of my security deposit, I didn't think it was fair, whatever. I almost never hear that anymore. It's almost always people looking for affordable places to rent. So I think we've also got to use enough carrot that we're having people to invest in that. And all this new housing that's being built in Oshkosh is not really affordable. For the most part, it's upscale. And so I really think we want to start looking at our old neighborhoods too as a resource, maybe a resource to be developed for affordable housing.
Which people aren't doing their homework?
I'm sorry?
Which people, you said some people don't do their homework till it's too late. Which people are not doing their homework? I didn't really understand that metaphor.
Well, I think tenants and landlords a lot of times aren't doing, someone said before they had problems, and one of my biggest pieces of advice is always get everything in writing, you know, right from the jump, you know, and they just think that, I think there's improvements on both ends. Yeah, that's all.
Can you give one example, since you brought up this reactive versus proactive thing? Can you give like one other example of a reactive policy and one other example of a proactive policy? Because I'm also unclear as to what that means. What that sounds just kind of buzzy.
I think education and also, you know, making people aware. I think better communication. I would like to see some
communication between who, for what?
Well, I would like to see at least like once a year somebody from the inspection department that we could talk about the most common violations and how to prevent them. I think that would go a long ways. You know, actually have some public meetings.
Like this one?
You know, what's that?
Like this one?
I'm more of just the inspection department and maybe stakeholders in the rental community just saying, what are you seeing a lot of and how can be prevented or corrected, you know, beforehand.
And those are examples of reactive or proactive?
That would be proactive, yeah.
Okay, so what's another example of a reactive policy?
I don't know what you're doing right now is reactive. You know, I mean, I'm more concentrated on the proactive. I don't know what other examples you're looking for as far as.
Well, I just don't understand what that means in that case, and if there's no difference between reactive and proactive, I don't understand why that statement matters.
I'm not arguing semantics. I'm just giving suggestions that I felt were valid. You know, so.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think one thing that would be reactive, not meaning to speak for Mr. Lord, but I think one thing that is reactive is when a landlord hasn't done something, but then it's inspected and then he does have to do something. That's reactive as opposed to being proactive and taking a look at the inspection sheet that we've been given tonight and going through it himself or herself and saying, geez, are these things, am I in compliance with these various things? I think that this would be a way of being proactive. I also think one of the biggest problems that I saw in my 18 or 19 years of being a landlord is that far too many landlords in this community are not members of an apartment association. Would you agree with me on that, Mr. Lord? And therefore, they don't know what the laws are. A number of laws just changed recently, and I would be willing to bet that the better majority of landlords in this community and others are not aware of what the changes even are. They don't care. They don't know that changes have occurred. They don't care to educate themselves, or they're just simply naive in that they don't understand that the law has changed. I still hear about landlords writing in a blank space on a lease that tenants must shampoo carpets upon leaving the property. And that's been illegal since 1999. So landlords need to educate themselves, and if they're not a member of an apartment association or they don't go online, I don't know how they're going to know what the laws are. So I think that's one of the biggest problems that we have here.
Just to follow up there, Cheryl, thank you for that. Mr. Davis, do you know, does Act 317, or did we look at whether or not that prohibits us from issuing an occupancy, because we already have an occupancy permit, right? Does Act 317 prevent us from issuing a, I guess, rental permit?
I don't know off the top of my head. I'm not sure a rental permit would actually be covered under this section of the law. This is for an inspection program of rental units. I'd have to do some research on a rental permit or license.
I think that's already illegal under state law.
I think that would start looking like a license, and I don't think that's legal.
Right. In Act 317, please go up there. Yeah, in Act 317, I believe it just outlines if you have a rental program, here's what it can contain, and I don't believe permit is in that.
I think you're right.
So, yeah, that may be another state issue then, if the state deems that before you can rent residences, you would be required for, or licensure would be required, so that would be a state issue.
Yeah.
Is there anybody else from the public? Okay, well, I did have one last slide that I didn't get to. It's next steps. The last slide, the next steps, I don't know if this thing even works anymore. Yes, it does. Everybody should see this on their handouts. We'll continue to gather public input. Another plug for the Polco poll. We even have the computer set up somewhere over here that if people don't have internet at their home, they could fill that out right now. The Rental Housing Advisory Board will continue to meet and provide input, and I expect at some point Rental Housing Advisory Board could recommend one or more of these inspection programs and one or more districts. Those all get forwarded to the City Council. It is the City Council who decides the final district and inspection programs, and then we'd have to update the city codes and fee schedules accordingly. And then, last but not least, communicate the decision to tenants, landlords, neighbors, and the balance of the community as to what the council has decided. And as reminders, the complaint-based inspections would continue, and the existing gateway inspections would continue. And then, in summary, the no decisions have been made, but Rental Housing Advisory Board will take this up next week at their regularly scheduled meeting. And depending on what their schedule permits, I expect they can forward some kind of recommendation to council later this fall that council could consider and then take effect in early 2019.
One housekeeping question on that, Mr. Davis. When this goes to Rental Housing Advisory Board for consideration, will we only be providing the visual maps, or would there be, for example, a list of the blocks, like have been highlighted with ranking.
I think it's kind of up to the Rental Housing Advisory Board. You could pick just about any block, is my understanding, or you could pick one block here, one block here, one block here, one block here. It could be the entire neighborhood with every fill-in block, but I don't think there's anything the legislature said prohibits you from, they have to be contiguous or anything like that.
Right. So my question is, will Rental Housing Advisory Board be provided a list of all of those blocks that have that with a ranking based on how you identified, or how we identified those
I
more?
believe with our GIS people, if you request that, we could probably put that together in short order, because the data that supports all that mapping is already in the database and can be reported out. So I'll put that on the list of things that we'd like to get to you as soon as possible.
Because it could be the case, as I understand it, that rental housing could look at this, they could make the recommendation to council that, you know, we want to do A and B, or a form of A and a portion of B, but then perhaps they might make a recommendation that was in phases or non-contiguous.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks.
One quick question. Would it be advisable to invite some representatives, some student government at the university to attend some of these meetings for their input? They are a large rental population in this community, and many reside in potentially target area. I'll ask you two guys.
We can talk to the OSA about it, I'm sure, and see what they want.
All the meetings are open to the public, so
Right.
there is a public input session at the beginning of the meeting.
And that meeting meets the second Wednesday at 3:30 in, this month?
406.
In 406.
Yep, for a few more months.
Can I make one more comment? Sure. I'm a little concerned on the criminal behavior as a screen. In April of 2016, landlords could no longer use certain criminal behavior in their screening, and if it wasn't related to housing. So I think you want to be careful what you're using criminal behavior for if it's not related to, property or housing. You might find you might be breaking fair housing laws. So.
And as a follow-up to that, I believe with these criteria were screened by the attorney's office that they could be viewed as blighting influences in a neighborhood. So that's why they gave us the okay to use those criteria. But your point is well taken.
I hear gunshots are moving. Like that. Gunshots are moving.
All right, well, this concludes the presentation section. Staff will hang around for a few more minutes if people want to look at the maps, and we'd be happy to answer any questions. The Polco poll still will be open for the next week or so, as well as we still have those handouts I referenced earlier. So thank you, everybody.
And thank you, everyone on the
Thank you.
board for all your hard work and many hours of sorting through
a complex
Act
issue.
317, which